Whitney and I decided to come inside today. It's really humid out there, and so it was fogging up the lens on our camera and all, so we decided that we'd move into the office here and tape the program from there. To sort of bring us up to date where Paul is in the book of Acts, he's just finished the third of his missionary journeys. He's come to Jerusalem, and there James has asked him if he's aware of all these thousands who are believers and yet are zealous for the law. And so Paul agrees to be at charge for some men who have a vow on themselves. And in the course of his trying to pay that vow and offer the sacrifice, there is a riot that develops in the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, they called it, which was the biggest of the courts around the temple. And so there is some Jews gathered together there. And I don't know really if we have to decide whether they were Jewish Christians or just Jews generally. But I suspect that there was some of each. At any rate, they are ready, and they try to take Paul outside the temple area, and they want to stone him. They want to kill him like they killed Stephen. But as it happens in the process, the commander of the Roman troops in the Antonia fortress, which was right on the corner of the temple area, the commander of the Antonia fortress was told about the disturbance that was taking place in the temple, and he brought a contingent of soldiers out to rescue Paul. For your information, the way a tribune had 6 centurions, 6 centuries, 6 bodies of 100 men each that were under his control. In my translation, he's called the commander, but probably something like a tribune would be a better way to designate the man. He was a step above a centurion, but of course subject to the man who commanded a legion of men, a great general of the Romans. And so Paul is slated to be rescued by the tribune, by a man named Claudius Lysias. He is not named at first. It is not until Paul is taken to Caesarea as a prisoner that Claudius Lysias comes across as a name. He writes a letter to Felix concerning Paul when he delivers Paul over to his care. But for a time, Paul is in the city of Jerusalem, and there is a great disturbance in the court of the Gentiles, and the tribune comes out with a contingency of soldiers to rescue Paul. He can't find out what's going along. One person is shouting one thing, and another person is shouting something else, and so the tribune decides to take Paul into the fortress, and there he would quiz him. There he would ask him questions. But before he quizzed Paul, before he asked him any questions, he would soften Paul up a little bit, that is, turn him over to soldiers who would use a whip on him and beat him within an inch of his life. Beat him until he had a little bit that he could say yes and no at least. But regularly that was done to people who were of low estate, and especially it was done to slaves. Paul was not a slave, but the tribune did figure that Paul was a man of low estate, of little esteem among the Jews. And so he takes Paul inside, and Paul stops him and asks him, speaking Greek, asked him if he could say a few words to the mob that was surrounding him. And the tribune was surprised that Paul spoke Greek so well, and so he let him speak. Paul addressed the crowd then in the Aramaic language, which was the common tongue of Jerusalem. And so he told them what happened when he was converted to Christ. He had gone to Damascus, and on the way Christ had appeared to him in a vision. He had been stricken from his horse. Ananias, a man of Damascus came and taught him the way of Christ more perfectly. And so he says a few things about his conversion here in the 22nd chapter of the book of Acts. It is here that Ananias says, "Why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized." I always cite the passage in the King James Version because it's the first place where I learned it. But why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins. And so Paul still had his sins on him when Ananias came with the message of Christ. And Ananias told him that he was going to have to, and Jesus had told him, that he was going to spend the rest of his life preaching and teaching among the Gentiles. But, of course, he's still captive, and so the centurion, or the tribune, causes Paul to be taken inside the castle. The King James translates the castle. It's actually a fortress. And so Paul is taken inside, and he is getting ready to be examined. That is, his hands are being tied above his head, and he's being put in place with some leather thongs so that he can't move when he's beaten within an inch of his life. So for the second time in Paul's missionary work, he points out to the person who is going to do the beating, he points out that he's a Roman citizen. At first that was the centurion. The tribune had already gone over to his quarters. But the centurion took the word back to the tribune. He says, "Do you know what you're doing in examining this man with a whip? Because he's a Roman citizen." Well, that scared the tribune because, they were under tribunes. Anybody else was under authority to protect Roman citizens wherever they found them. And so Claudius Lysias came back into the room where Paul was, and he says, "I obtained my citizenship," Claudius Lysias now speaking, "I obtained my citizenship at a considerable price. How much did you have to pay?" And Paul said, "I didn't pay anything. I was born a citizen." So that says a little something about Paul's background, about his family. That's about all that we know about Paul's family. Well, Lysias is afraid to do anything against Paul, but he still has the problem on his hands of figuring out what charge. What had Paul done that had resulted in all these things? And so the next day the Sanhedrin was meeting. The Sanhedrin was the chief court authority of the Jews. It was seen over by the high priest. At the time it was a man named Ananias, not to be confused with the Annas that saw Jesus in John's Gospel. He sees Jesus a short time before Jesus is tried and crucified. But this man, Ananias, of course, hates everything Christian, and he hates Paul. And so he is overseeing the Sanhedrin. Now, the idea of the Sanhedrin was that it was a court of 71, 72 men. There are disputes about that, and no sense in our going into it. It was somewhere in the area of 70 men that were overseeing Paul and trying him so that they would have some report to give to Claudius Lysias. But the Bible says that Paul knew that there were Sadducees and Pharisees there in the Sanhedrin, and he knew how to turn them on one another. And so he began speaking of the resurrection from the dead. And soon they were slugging it out with one another, and Claudius Lysias still has no charge to bring. And so Paul is taken back into the fortress, and he's going to be examined regardless of his being a Roman citizen. But the Jews, in the meantime, make a plot. They say, well, if you can't kill this man, to Claudius Lysias, they say, we will send you, or they say it rather, to the high priest. At a certain time, we will send you a message telling you that we need to see Paul ourselves. And so if you will get some guards and send Paul over, along the way, we'll overpower the guards and we'll take Paul out and do to him what we wanted to do from the beginning. Well, that seems like a pretty good plan, except that Paul's nephew learns about it. Now, again, this is the first time in the Bible and the only time that some of Paul's relatives are mentioned by name. A sister, maybe she lived in Jerusalem, maybe the sister lived in Tarsus and had sent a son to Jerusalem to study, like Paul had been sent as a young man to study at the feet of Gamaliel. And so the nephew of Paul tells him what the plot, I don't know how he learned this, but however he did somehow. And so he advises Claudius Lysias not to send Paul when they summoned him. And Claudius Lysias said, "Well, how did you find this out?" And so there's I don't know, 3 or 4 verses of conversation between Paul's nephew and Claudius Lysias. And Claudius Lysias determines to get together a contingency of soldiers, of troops, some of them bearing spears, and some of them part of the cavalry. And they are to take Paul a certain distance towards Caesarea, leave it with the cavalry then, and the cavalry was to take Paul on to Caesarea. Clearly, Claudius Lysias wants out of the deal. He doesn't want to be responsible for anything. If Paul gets killed, and Paul is a Roman citizen, he's in a lot of trouble. And so Paul is shipped, or is sent over to Caesarea. Now remember, Caesarea is the normal Roman capital city in that part of the world. It was a thoroughly Roman city. It had all the institutions of a Greco-Roman city. The modern archaeologists have uncovered a theater there, and other things, other buildings, notably aqueducts that had brought water into the area. And so it was a thoroughly Roman city. It was where the Roman governor normally spent his time. I think the only reason that Pontius Pilate was in Jerusalem at the time that Jesus was crucified was because he wanted to be on hand in case there was any disturbance. But the normal place where the Roman governor had his seat was in the city of Caesarea. And so Paul stays there for a time, and the Jews in Jerusalem, Ananias and the rest of them, hire an orator. An orator, I guess, would be we would call it a lawyer, but he was clearly a smooth-spoken fella, and he was going to come and bring charges against Paul before Felix. Felix was a thoroughly no-account man by all the records that we have. Josephus talks about the Roman historian, Jewish Roman historian, talks about Felix at some length. He had been born a slave, but had risen in power, had gotten to know Claudius and Caligula, and had risen in power among the Romans, and he was given this area of Jerusalem and Judea to reign over. And of course, he was expected to become. It was going to be worth his while. He would make enough money through bribery and such as that to get along fine. The Romans had laws against bribery, but nobody paid any attention to them, as far away as Palestine was from Rome. And so he listens to the charges that the Tertullius, he is actually this orator is even mentioned by name. I'm trying to find it on the page, but I can't. But at any rate, Paul was, this man accused Paul before Felix. And then Felix gave Paul permission to speak. And he says that he was going up to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was south, but it was up where Jerusalem was in the mountains. And so he had sent Paul. Paul had gone up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, where the riot and everything had occurred after Paul had been in Jerusalem and was ready to be at expense for some Jews who had a vow. And so now there is an orator who brings the case against Paul, and when Paul is given permission to speak, he does. This is really thoroughly New Testament world. The orator and Paul both began their speeches by telling Felix what a great guy he is, and how the whole country and provinces prospered under him, and that they feel so fortunate to be able to make their case here before Felix. Paul says, well, in the first place, what they're talking about would have taken longer than a week or two. And you know, or at least you can find out from the Jews, that I haven't been in Jerusalem for very long, that I came to Jerusalem to deliver a charitable gift to my people, to the poor of my people. And it's the only time in the book of Acts, or the only time in Acts, that Paul's collection is mentioned. Now, it all fits together. In the 20th chapter, there are about 7 important people that go with Paul as he goes toward Jerusalem at the end of the third journey. So, you know, we have an explanation of why so many men would have accompanied Paul. But this is the only time in Acts that the contribution is actually mentioned. Paul says this in the 24th or 25th chapter, the 24th chapter. I've had this Bible so long that the pages all stick together. Paul said to Felix, now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. And that's the only mention that we have of Paul's collection in Acts. But he says a lot about it in 2 Corinthians and a considerable bit in the book of Romans, in Romans 15. It was clearly an important thing for Paul, this collection that he was taking up for the poor in Jerusalem. Well, Felix listens to the charges that are brought against Paul and to Paul's self-defense, and he says, well, when Lysias comes down, when Claudius Lysias comes down to Caesarea, I will inquire of him. I'll find more things about the case. For now, he says to the centurion, Felix says, why don't you lock Paul up, and we'll keep him here safely. If he should try to cause any more trouble, we'll know about it. And it's there that it says that his real reason for doing so was that he hoped that Paul's friends would provide him with a ransom, would provide him with money. That was one of the ways that Felix hoped to become rich. The statements that we have about Felix outside the New Testament says that he ruled like a slave would rule. He was born a slave, and it was not very often. A slave might have the money, might save money he had earned or his master had let him earn. So a slave might be able to buy his freedom, and sometimes there was a master who would give a slave his freedom. But normally that wasn't expected. But in this case, Felix had gotten his freedom. He had been made a free man, and he had risen to an important station. But things were about to fall apart for Felix. Paul is imprisoned there 2 years, and at the end of that 2 years, there's a change in governorship. There's another man, Festus, who comes to take over. And the speech before Festus and Agrippa we might know about better than any of Paul's speeches. Paul reasoned about judgment to come, about righteousness, about what kind of man he would be. It says in verse 22, I'm still in chapter 24, verse 22, but Felix, having a more exact knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will decide your case. In the meantime, Paul was kept as a prisoner there. There are, of course, 4 of Paul's letters that are called prison epistles, and in all 4 of them he mentions his being enslaved. It may be that he wrote three or one or three of those epistles, or maybe all four of them, from Caesarea while he was in jail there. But this isn't the last place that Paul is going to end up. When he's before Festus and Agrippa, Festus wants to send him back to Jerusalem to try to keep the Jews on his side. He wants to send Paul back to be tried there. But of course, Paul would never have made it. As soon as the Jews, a certain segment at least of the Jews, had known that Paul was on the way, they had made plans to jump out behind a rock somewhere along the way and to kill Paul. They were out to kill him. And I believe, as I've mentioned before, that much of the difficulty that Paul has in the book of Acts with the Jews are with Christian Jews who wanted to impose the law of Moses on Christian converts, so that the church was to be a sort of an adjunct of the synagogue. A lot of people don't agree with that, but it's what I think that we're encountering in 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 especially, and probably in chapter 3 of 2 Corinthians. And it's what we face in the Galatian letter as well. Well, we'll wait till next time to see Paul's speech before Agrippa and Festus and Paul's appeal to Caesar. So there's at least one more lesson that we have on Paul, maybe two more, on Paul in the city, or as he's in Palestine, and how he eventually comes toward Jerusalem or toward Rome and is there in prison for 2 years. The book of Acts says that he was in prison there 2 years. But that's sort of the way things end in Acts. Presumably, he, as a result of his appealing to Caesar, he stood before Caesar as his judge. At the time, that would have been Claudius. But it's hard to believe that Claudius would have spent his time hearing cases of unimportant people from Palestine over an unimportant matter, the difference between Christianity and Judaism. But we'll pick up there next week.